King Parikshit began his life with a level of protection most could never imagine. While still in his mother's womb, he was shielded by Lord Vishnu, a divine intervention that kept the growing darkness of the Kali Yuga at bay. But that protection didn't make him immune to his own biology. Years later, while hunting in a remote forest, the king found himself separated from his retinue. Dehydrated and physically spent, his royal poise began to fail him. He reached the ashram of the sage Shuka, who was deep in a meditative trance. When the sage failed to respond to his pleas for water, his fatigue turned to bitterness. He found a dead snake nearby and draped it over the sage's shoulders as a silent insult. Parikshit walked away, leaving the forest behind. He assumed the incident was over, unaware that his brief lapse in self-control had already set a deadline for his life. Even with a divine shield in his past, the king proved that a single moment of unchecked ego can leave the most powerful ruler exposed. When the sage's son, Shringi, discovered the dead serpent on his father, he didn't see a thirsty traveler. He saw a king who had mocked the sacred. In his fury, he channeled his ascetic power into a highly specific and lethal curse. The curse came with a fixed timeline. Parikshit would have exactly 7 days. On the final evening, the serpent king Takshaka would deliver a fatal bite. Back at the palace, the king realized that his walls, his loyal ministers, and his standing army were useless against this threat. You cannot negotiate with a divine clock. The knowledge of his exact end date shifted his priorities instantly. He was no longer concerned with managing an empire. He was forced to reckon with what remained of his own time. Rather than searching for a way to break the curse, Parikshit accepted the reality of his mistake. He didn't blame the sage or the sun. He looked inward. He abdicated the throne, passing the crown to his son Janameja, and walked away from the comforts of the palace for good. He traveled to the banks of the Ganges, sat on a bed of kusha grass, and began a fast that would only end with his death. His presence drew the attention of the sage Shuka, a figure of immense wisdom who arrived to witness the king's final days. Parikshit didn't ask for a miracle. He asked Shukadev for a path. He wanted to know how a person, burdened by their own errors, could find spiritual liberation in a week. Parikshit stopped trying to save his body and focused entirely on the state of his consciousness. Shukadev's response was to zoom out. He began to describe the universe not as a backdrop for human kings, but as a vast repeating cycle of creation. He detailed the origin: Lord Vishnu waking from a cosmic sleep, and a lotus blooming from his center to bring forth Brahma, the architect of the physical world. Brahma divided his form into 2 parts, creating the first human archetypes, Manu and Shatarupa. This lineage expanded through sage Kashyapa and his 13 wives, bringing forth the entire spectrum of life: gods, demons, animals, plants, and serpents. As the list grew to include thousands of species and millions of years, the king's own 70-year reign and 7-day deadline began to look like a single drop in an ocean. By seeing himself as a small node in this massive, interconnected web of life, the king's personal tragedy lost its weight. He wasn't a man losing everything. He was a temporary form returning to the system that created him. On the 7th day, as the sun hung low in the sky, a sense of relief began to spread through the king's remaining courtiers. The hour of the curse was almost over. Takshaka, the serpent king, had already bypassed the guards. He was hiding as a microscopic black worm, tucked away inside a piece of fruit offered to the king by a visitor. Parikshit saw the worm. He didn't recoil or call for his guards. Instead, he picked up the fruit and joked that since the sun was setting, the serpent king was running out of time to catch him. As the sun touched the horizon, the worm shifted. It expanded into the massive form of Takshaka, who delivered the bite the curse had promised. And so the serpent took the king's physical body, but the version of Parikshit that feared death had already vanished days ago during his study with the sage. The aftermath followed a different path. Parikshit's son, Janameja, responded with fire. He launched a massive sacrifice to draw every snake on earth into a pit of flames to avenge his father. This was an attempt to overwrite fate with violence. While his father had spent his last days letting go, Janamejaya was trying to force the world to bend to his will. The slaughter only stopped when the sage Astika intervened, explaining that the serpent was merely an instrument of a destiny the king had already accepted. Janamejaya was left with the ashes of 1 billion serpents, while Parikshit left behind the example of a man who stopped fighting the external clock and finally found peace within it.